John and Sarah Evans had everything anyone could want: a perfect marriage, a beautiful home, and a life that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. But when they invited Claire into their world, they unknowingly opened the door to a nightmare that would unravel everything they held dear. What started as a harmless exploration of desire soon spiraled into a web of betrayal, manipulation, and a love triangle that would change their lives forever. John and Sarah Evans were the kind of couple everyone admired. They had met during their college years, where John, a quiet yet ambitious young man, had caught the eye of Sarah, a free-spirited and charismatic woman. Their chemistry was instant, and what began as a friendship soon blossomed into a love story that seemed destined for happily ever after. Over the years, their relationship evolved from youthful infatuation to a deep, unwavering bond. They moved into a beautiful house in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, where they quickly became the golden couple everyone looked up to. John worked as a successful architect, designing sleek, modern buildings that turned heads in the city. His reputation was impeccable, and he had built a career he was proud of. Sarah, on the other hand, had started her own boutique business. It was small, but it was growing steadily, and she had a loyal customer base that adored her sense of style and her personable nature. Together, they formed the perfect pair, a team that seemed untouchable by the outside world. They were admired not just for their individual successes, but for the way they complemented each other perfectly. To their friends, John and Sarah's life appeared flawless. They threw elegant dinner parties, went on lavish vacations, and maintained a pristine image in their community. They were the type of couple that made everyone believe that true love, success, and happiness were attainable. Even their social media accounts showcased the ideal life: a picturesque couple living the dream, traveling to exotic places, and posting pictures of their perfectly styled home and lavish gatherings. On the outside, they had it all. But like any perfect facade, it came with its cracks. What most didn't know was that beneath the surface, John and Sarah shared a secret that had slowly crept into their lives over the years, one that neither of them fully understood at first. It started with idle conversations during late-night dinners or quiet walks in the park, topics that seemed harmless at the time. They began talking about their fantasies, things that had always lingered in the back of their minds but were never acted upon. It was innocent at first, just sharing what-ifs, indulging in playful thoughts. But as they discussed these fantasies, something shifted. What had started as an occasional thought became something they both felt drawn to. They began exploring ideas that seemed a little unconventional, a little risky, and a little thrilling. Their shared curiosity grew stronger with time, and they found themselves wondering about the possibility of introducing someone else into their relationship. It wasn't about replacing each other. They assured themselves it was just about broadening their experiences, adding a new layer to their already deep connection. The thought of someone else sharing in their intimacy sparked a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was a secret they kept to themselves, not even sharing it with their closest friends. After all, the world saw them as the perfect couple. Why risk shattering that image over something as complex and potentially dangerous as opening up their marriage? As time passed, their secret desire simmered beneath the surface, slowly becoming a more persistent thought. The curiosity began to feel like a need, a hunger that neither John nor Sarah could fully ignore. And the more they talked about it, the more the idea seemed possible. They had always been open-minded, both in life and in their relationship. Maybe, just maybe, they could handle it. They would experiment, and if it didn't work, they could go back to their life as it was. No harm done. That was the plan, at least. Neither of them could have predicted how far this experiment would take them or how much it would ultimately change their lives. The decision to seek out someone else would be the first step in a chain of events that neither John nor Sarah could have anticipated. The allure of something new and exciting had started as an innocent curiosity, but it was about to spiral into something much darker, something that would change their lives forever. The search for someone to join their relationship began almost casually, as John and Sarah started scouring online forums and discreet websites. At first, it was just a way to explore the idea further, to see if other couples were engaging in similar experiences. They didn't want to rush into anything. They had agreed to take it slow, ensuring that they could still maintain control over their lives, their marriage, and their image. The initial conversations were filled with hesitation and curiosity, but as time passed, they began to grow more comfortable with the idea of finding a third person. The thought of exploring this together, of pushing boundaries while remaining a unit, felt exciting, almost like an adventure they could share. It wasn't long before they stumbled across Claire's profile. She was everything they had imagined. A beautiful woman in her early 30s with a magnetic presence that seemed to leap off the screen. Her photographs portrayed a woman with confidence, elegance, and a carefree energy. She shared similar interests with John and Sarah: art, travel, fine wine, and intellectual conversation. She also described herself as open-minded, exploring non-traditional relationships. It felt like fate. Claire seemed like the perfect fit, someone who could integrate into their lives without disrupting the carefully cultivated image of their perfect marriage. After a few exchanges, John and Sarah agreed to meet Claire in person. They chose a trendy bar in the city, a place that wasn't too far from their suburban home, but far enough to feel like an escape. The moment they laid eyes on her, there was an undeniable chemistry. Claire was even more striking in person. Her deep, captivating eyes seemed to hold secrets, and her laugh was infectious. John and Sarah were both drawn to her in ways they hadn't expected. There was an effortless connection, and after a few drinks and light conversation, the tension in the air shifted from casual to something more intimate. They all shared a spark, an energy that was too palpable to ignore. Over the next few weeks, they met up several times: dinner dates, visits to galleries, and even weekend getaways. What had started as an innocent exploration into something new began to feel more real, more dangerous. The boundaries between friendship and something else blurred with every encounter. John and Sarah found themselves looking forward to their time with Claire, even more than they had anticipated. At first, it was just a harmless flirtation, a few playful touches here and there. But as they spent more time together, the lines began to shift. There was no longer a clear distinction between just two people in a marriage and a third party. It was as if the three of them formed a new kind of dynamic. The first time they were all together in an intimate setting, everything felt surreal. It was late one evening, and after a few drinks, the atmosphere turned electric. John and Sarah had spent the night talking about the possibilities, and when Claire joined them in their home, they felt both exhilarated and nervous. The air was thick with anticipation. What had started as a thought, a curiosity, had now become something tangible. They moved closer, the chemistry undeniable, and the night unfolded in a way that neither John nor Sarah could have predicted. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The connection they shared with Claire was intense and raw, and for a brief moment they felt like they were truly exploring something new, something they couldn't have experienced on their own. But it wasn't just fun and games. The more time they spent together, the more things began to shift beneath the surface. What started as an agreement to explore this new adventure soon felt like something much more complicated. John began to feel possessive over Claire in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't just want her in their lives as a third, he wanted her for himself. There was jealousy creeping in, a feeling that made him uncomfortable, yet he couldn't shake it. Sarah, too, felt the strain of their arrangement. At first she'd been excited about the idea, but now she couldn't help but notice how close John and Claire were becoming. It was as if they had a connection that was entirely separate from her, something that she was no longer a part of. She tried to push these feelings down, but they lingered, gnawing at her. With each passing meeting, the situation grew more complex. The thrill of exploring this uncharted territory had turned into a web of emotions and desires that neither John nor Sarah fully understood. They had once believed they could control the situation, that they could balance their desires with their love for each other. But now, they were beginning to realize that they might have opened a door they couldn't close. What had started as an innocent curiosity was now spiraling out of control, and neither of them knew how to stop it. As the months passed, the arrangement between John, Sarah, and Claire deepened. What had begun as an experimental flirtation, a way to explore uncharted territory, had slowly transformed into something more complex and far more difficult to control. The lines between affection, lust, and jealousy were becoming increasingly blurred, and John and Sarah found themselves navigating emotions they weren't prepared for. At first, they had maintained an understanding. This was supposed to be a temporary exploration. It wasn't meant to change anything between them, only to add an exciting layer to their relationship, but it didn't take long for the emotional dynamics to shift. John found himself feeling possessive over Claire, something he hadn't anticipated. What had once been a casual connection between the three of them had turned into something much more intimate, and it wasn't just Sarah who felt it. John began to spend more time with Claire, outside of Sarah's presence. They would go on lunch dates, share private moments that didn't include Sarah, and John began to confide in Claire in ways he hadn't done with his wife in years. As John grew closer to Claire, Sarah felt the distance between her and her husband grow. At first, she tried to dismiss the feelings of jealousy that crept up. After all, they had agreed to this together. But it wasn't just the idea of sharing John with another woman that bothered her. It was the emotional connection that seemed to be developing between him and Claire, one that felt more genuine, more natural than the bond Sarah had with him in recent months. Sarah started to feel like an outsider in her own marriage, watching as her husband became more and more captivated by Claire. There were late-night texts, whispered conversations, and glances shared between them that made Sarah feel like she no longer knew her own husband. It was during one of these moments of realization that Sarah found herself questioning everything. One night, as she sat alone in their living room, John and Claire had gone out for drinks together, leaving Sarah at home. The space between her and John felt palpable, and it made her wonder how much longer they could continue like this. They returned that evening. Claire's presence seemed to fill the house in a way that made Sarah uneasy. She wasn't sure if it was the growing affection between John and Claire or the unsettling realization that their experiment had gone too far. Whatever it was, Sarah could feel it. This was no longer just about them as a couple. Something was changing, and she wasn't sure she could handle it. The tension only increased when John and Claire began spending more time together in private. John would disappear into his office to work on a project, only for Claire to arrive, and the two of them would spend hours talking and laughing in ways that Sarah could only observe from a distance. It seemed as though their connection was growing deeper, and despite Sarah's attempts to engage with them both, she felt like a third wheel in her own home. The dynamic had shifted, and it was becoming harder to deny the discomfort that had settled in her chest. In an attempt to salvage the situation, Sarah tried to initiate more intimate moments with John, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The spark between them seemed to have faded, replaced by a sense of distance she couldn't bridge. John, though loving and caring, was distracted, his mind often drifting to Claire. He seemed to be withdrawing, emotionally and physically, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the connection between them was slipping away permanently. What they had built together for years, their once unshakable bond, was now being threatened by a third person. Despite the growing unease, neither John nor Sarah was ready to confront the truth. They were afraid to acknowledge that this experiment was no longer fun or harmless. The pressure to maintain their image as the perfect couple weighed heavily on them. Their friends and family had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. On the outside, they were still the Evanses, the successful, attractive couple everyone admired. But inside, things were unraveling in ways they couldn't have predicted. The perfect life they had carefully curated was starting to crack, and neither of them knew how to fix it. John and Sarah had always prided themselves on their strong communication and trust, but now that foundation was starting to crumble. They both wanted to believe that things could go back to normal, that their marriage could survive this, that their connection was strong enough to weather any storm. But deep down, they knew something had shifted beyond repair. The triangle they had so carefully crafted was now a tangled mess of emotions, jealousy and confusion, and neither John nor Sarah knew how to untangle it before it consumed them both. One evening, the tension in the Evans household reached its breaking point. It had been building for months. Silent resentments, unspoken fears, and the growing divide between John, Sarah, and Claire. Sarah had tried to ignore the nagging feeling in her gut, hoping it would subside with time. But it didn't. Instead, it festered, growing into a quiet storm that no one could avoid. What was supposed to be an exciting and adventurous exploration had devolved into a web of emotions that no one knew how to navigate. The breaking point came unexpectedly during one of their usual gatherings. Claire had come over to spend time with John and Sarah, as she had many times before. The evening started like any other, light conversation, a glass of wine, and laughter. But something felt off, a subtle shift in the air that neither John nor Sarah could ignore. Sarah noticed the way Claire and John interacted too closely, too comfortably. The way Claire's hand lingered on John's arm, the way they shared private jokes, as though Sarah wasn't even in the room. It wasn't the first time she'd seen this, but tonight it felt different. It was as if Claire and John were in a world of their own, and Sarah had been left behind. A growing sense of unease washed over Sarah, and she couldn't hold it in any longer. She had tried to brush off the jealousy, tried to convince herself that this was just part of the experiment, but the truth was undeniable. John had changed. He wasn't the man she had married. He wasn't the person who had once been her confidant and partner. He was slipping away, and the more time he spent with Claire, the more distant he became from Sarah. She had been patient, understanding. But tonight, something inside her snapped. Without thinking, Sarah confronted John and Claire. She didn't plan it, but the words came out in a rush, her voice tight with emotion. She asked John why he was acting this way, why he was pulling away from her and growing so close to Claire. She demanded to know what had happened to their marriage, to the bond they had once shared so easily. The words were sharp and cutting, and they seemed to hang in the air like a weight neither of them could lift. John, taken aback by the intensity of her words, stammered, trying to explain. But his words didn't sound convincing to Sarah. There was a hesitation in his voice, a shift that made her realize something had been brewing beneath the surface for longer than she cared to admit. Claire, sitting silently in the corner, had a look on her face that was difficult to decipher. Guilt, confusion, or was it something more? The room felt suffocating as Sarah's anger and hurt filled the space. John tried to reassure her, telling her that it wasn't what she thought, that everything was fine, that he still loved her. But Sarah couldn't hear it. The damage had already been done. She could see it now. The way John's eyes lingered on Claire, the way he seemed to prioritize their time together over his marriage. What had started as an experiment, a way to explore something new and exciting, had turned into something more dangerous, something that threatened to tear apart everything they had built together. The argument escalated quickly, and soon it became clear that this was no longer just about the three of them and their arrangement. It was about trust, love, and the realization that what they were doing was no longer healthy. The boundaries had been crossed and emotions had been stirred in ways none of them could control. John and Sarah were no longer on the same page. They hadn't been for a while. And Claire, caught in the middle, seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. In a moment of emotional turmoil, Claire stood up and left. Her departure was abrupt, and for a moment, the house felt empty, devoid of any energy. John sat there, stunned, as Sarah's anger turned to sorrow. She had wanted clarity, a sense of control over a situation that had spiraled out of control, but now all she had was confusion and pain. She couldn't shake the feeling that Claire's presence had been a catalyst for something much darker, something that had exposed the cracks in their marriage. As the night wore on, Sarah and John sat in silence, both too tired to speak, both too lost in their own thoughts to find any answers. Claire's sudden departure left a void, but it also opened up a space for reflection. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if they had gone too far, if the damage had already been done, and if there was any coming back from this. John sat beside her, his expression unreadable. The perfect life they had once known now seemed like a distant memory, and both of them were left to face the consequences of their decisions. In the quiet aftermath, the weight of their choices began to settle in. What had once seemed like a harmless adventure had turned into a complex web of emotions, secrets, and betrayal. They both knew it now. The triangle they had welcomed into their lives had become something far more dangerous, and the truth was impossible to ignore any longer. The days after Claire's abrupt departure were filled with a heavy silence that seemed to hang over the house like a dark cloud. John and Sarah's once vibrant home, filled with laughter and shared dreams, now felt like a hollow shell. Every room seemed to echo with the absence of something that had once felt so electric. It wasn't just the absence of Claire, it was the absence of their connection, the connection they had spent years building and nurturing. Now, that bond seemed fractured beyond repair. The first few days were the hardest. Sarah couldn't shake the image of Claire walking out of their door, her eyes cold and unreadable. She had expected a confrontation, perhaps an apology, something that would provide closure, but Claire had left with nothing but silence. Sarah's mind raced with questions, most of them unanswerable. Where had Claire gone? Why had she left so suddenly? Was there something more to her departure than just the fallout from their argument? The uncertainty gnawed at Sarah, and she found herself pacing the house, unable to focus on anything. John, on the other hand, seemed distant, almost withdrawn. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his words lacked the usual warmth Sarah had once found so comforting. His guilt was evident, but it wasn't enough to bridge the growing chasm between them. He tried to assure her that they would be fine, that they could move past this, but his assurances felt hollow. Sarah couldn't look at him without wondering if he had already made his choice, if his heart was no longer fully with her. The bond between them, once so solid, now felt fragile and tenuous, like it could snap at any moment. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's worry only deepened. She had spent hours searching for Claire online, trying to track her down, but all she found were dead ends. Claire had vanished, as if she had never existed. Sarah's suspicions grew. What if Claire wasn't just a temporary part of their lives? What if her departure wasn't a simple fallout of an ill-conceived arrangement, but part of something more sinister? It wasn't until one night, after weeks of turmoil, that Sarah stumbled upon the truth. She had been going through some of John's files on his computer when she found an encrypted folder, one that he had never mentioned. Her curiosity led her to unlock it, and what she discovered shook her to the core. The folder contained dozens of messages, texts, emails, and even financial documents between John and Claire. As she scrolled through the messages, Sarah realized that Claire hadn't just been a third in their relationship. She had been manipulating them both from the start. Claire had used her charm and allure to get close to John and Sarah, but there was more to her presence than Sarah had originally believed. Claire had been strategically weaving herself into their lives, gaining their trust and affection, only to take advantage of it. Sarah discovered that Claire had been siphoning money from John's accounts, forging signatures, and even influencing some of his business decisions. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal that cut the deepest. It was the realization that their lives had been carefully orchestrated by someone who had only been using them for her own gain. The shock of this revelation left Sarah reeling. She couldn't understand how she had been so blind, how she had allowed someone to manipulate her so completely. The guilt she felt for not seeing the signs earlier was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to the anger she felt toward John. He had been just as complicit, perhaps more so. The relationship he had shared with Claire, the private moments they had shared without Sarah, weren't just acts of desire. They were the seeds of a deeper betrayal. John had allowed Claire into their lives, had let her pull the strings in their marriage, all while pretending everything was fine. Confronting him was inevitable. That night, Sarah confronted John, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak. John, stunned by the discovery, tried to explain, but the words fell flat. He claimed he had no idea the extent of Claire's manipulation, but Sarah could see the cracks in his story. He had been too close to Claire, too involved to claim ignorance. The trust between them had shattered completely. In the weeks that followed, Sarah did what she had to do. She started the process of separating herself from John. It was a painful decision, but one that felt necessary. She had given so much of herself to a man who had been unable to protect her, unable to see the danger that Claire represented.